Hello and welcome to this podcast from the School of English at the University of Kent. I'm Dr Clare Wright. I'm a lecturer in medieval literature here in the school, and in what follows I'm going to talk through some approaches to the task of close reading, what it is, why it's important, and a few things that you can look out for. I'll also put some of what we cover into practice with extracts from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Miller's Tale and The Knight's Tale, two of the many stories that constitute his famous Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century. Now, this is a text I obviously know very well as a specialist in medieval English literature, but it's also a text I think is appropriate to the University of Kent, given that our main campus is located here in Canterbury. So I hope you will enjoy our little forays into Canterbury Tales as well. So firstly, what is close reading? Well, by this stage in your education, you will probably be familiar with close reading as an exercise, but I think it is nevertheless helpful to reiterate what the task of close reading involves, in order to have at the forefront of our minds this idea about close reading, what it is, why it's important, and so to understand therefore why it's important for literary studies and how it can be used. So in essence, close reading is a sustained, focused, detailed analysis of any given text or extract in which you unpack and examine its constituent elements. In other words, its nuts and bolts, the basic building blocks of a text, because it's these that really create a text's meaning. So most people will be able to read a text and to tell you what it means, but a really good close reading will tell you not only what it means, but how it means. So how it makes that meaning, how it generates that meaning for a reader. What are these specific elements, in other words, that drive or encourage a particular interpretation? Now, of course, no text is written or indeed read in a vacuum, and the particular historical, cultural and socio-economic and political contexts in which it is both composed and read will always inflect differently on its interpretation, and you will therefore need to have some sense of those to be able to interpret the text to the full extent possible. You'll also probably want to think about things like who is speaking, so who the narrator is of the text and how direct that voice is. You might also want to think about the relationship between the narrator and the writer where that is appropriate. You might want to think about questions of voice and characterization and so on and so forth. But what I really want to focus on in this podcast is the more technical aspects of close reading. So that is the linguistic and stylistic features of a text that you can look out for and analyse. And I want to say before we move on that close reading isn't just for exams, and it's not just for individual assessment exercises called close readings. Close reading really is the bread and butter of literary study. And literary analysis. It's what we do as researchers day in, day out, and it's what you as undergraduate students of literature will do regularly. It is furthermore a skill I think that can be applied well beyond an educational setting. It is perhaps one of the most useful of the transferable skills that literary study helps you to develop. So whether you're using it as a self-reflective process, in thinking about, for example, how best to write a tricky work email or to write a piece that's persuasive in some way, how to make an event that you're writing an advert for sound more exciting and getting more people to sign up for the event, or even if you're just reading a polemical newspaper or online article and you want to understand it more thoroughly, close reading skills can come into play in crucial ways. Okay, so where to start with close reading? Well, I think the very first place to start, most obviously, is in reading the text. But reading the text in such a way that you take time to do so. So take your time to read the text closely and carefully from beginning to end, and do this even in an exam situation. As you're going through, mark up any notable features of the text that you notice as you're reading through. So I always read with a pencil in hand. My texts are covered in scribbles. There's nothing pristine about them at all. If you have time, then I would repeat that process until you feel confident that you have a good sense of the text and clear points to talk around. So this really is an important and meticulous process, and it's worth dwelling on it before you start to write. Think of this process as locating the foundation stones on which the rest of your response can be built. So remember too that you won't be able to get all of the details on the first read through, especially if you are reading quickly. Nobody can do that, that's an impossible task. So taking the time to read through it a couple of times I think will really help you, even in exam situations. It will help you to develop a detailed understanding of the extract, whether or not you've seen it before, and so help you write a more considered and more detailed response. Once you've gone through this process, you should then be ready. You should then be ready to start your close reading response. So what kind of features of language and style might you look out for in a text? Well, in the following slides, I'm going to make a few suggestions, but I want to flag up that not all of these suggestions will be relevant for every single text that you will look at. Some will be more pertinent than others, and there may be other features that you identify that you can talk about and discuss. But I think these ones that I'm going to suggest are important ones, are sort of the big ones, if you like, and they should help you to begin to analyse any text that you come across. And I think often as readers, one of the first things that we notice about a text is its diction. That is the writer's choice of words and phrases. Now it's a sort of commonplace to say that words are never chosen accidentally by writers. They are always chosen very carefully and very deliberately. So it's worth thinking about diction in a text. And specifically, you might want to think about things like not just the meanings of words, but perhaps their connotations and polysemy. So the words often have more than one meaning or more than one sort of connotation, and writers can really capitalise on that semantic multiplicity in order to enrich and deepen a text's meaning. As I've just suggested, you can think about a word's connotations, but you can also think about its associations. So the associations or ideas with which it's connected, or real-world context, if you like, with which it is associated. You might also take note of when a writer perhaps employs both a word and its opposite, so the sort of diametric opposite of its particular meaning, or where a writer might use parallel words that invoke slightly different meanings, so synonyms that have slightly different meanings and connotations. And of course, each of these strategies will create different effects, and your task as the reader and as the analyzer of these texts will be to ask, how does the writer exploit that linguistic range? How does the writer make use of that linguistic versatility to help make the meaning of the text? So, this is, just as an example, Chaucer is a bit of a master of polysemy and using words to say much more than they literally mean. So, for example, this is the beginning of the Miller's Tale. And this is where Chaucer, or more accurately, his narrator, the Miller, describes one of the protagonists, the young scholar Nicholas, who is the lodger of John the Carpenter and Allison, John's young and very attractive wife. And this is what the narrator tells us. This clerke was cleped Hende Nicholas. Of derne love he could and of solace, and thereto he was slay, and full privé, and the maiden make for to say. A chambre hadde he in that hostelry, alone, withouten any company, full fetisly dict with herbes swart, and he himself as sweete as is the rot of licorice, or any catawal. So this clerk was called Hender Nicholas, and I'll explain that word in a moment. Of dearne love, of secret love, he was very good and of solace, and therefore he was sly and very private, and like a maiden meek to look at. A chamber he had in that hostelry, so in John the Carpenter's house, alone, without anybody else accompanying him, and he had decorated that room very fashionably with sweet herbs, and he himself was sweet like the root of licorice or caterwaul. And licorice or caterwaul were roots that people chewed on to help their breath smell a little bit nicer. So Chaucer's choice of words in this description, as always, is very telling, and they signal very clearly, I think, the duplicitous nature of Nicholas and the likely trouble he is about to cause for John the Carpenter, and possibly also his wife. Because all of these words have multiple meanings that align Nicholas both with the tradition and conventions of courtly love, but also with the notions of cleverness, of deceit, of trickery, and treachery. So, for example, Hender can mean things like handsome and noble and virtuous, and it's often used of courtly and knightly men in medieval romance. So romance is a genre of literature in this period that's all about knights going off on adventures, and it's explicitly about knights going off on adventures in far off distant mythological lands. But this word Hender can also mean clever and crafty. And the double meaning of this word is then continued in dearne, again a word often found in the genre of chivalric romance and courtly love poetry, and it means a secret love. So in courtly love conventions, a young knight or a squire usually falls in love with a woman who is either already married or who is well above his social station. In both cases, what that does is, of course, make the woman, ostensibly anyway, unattainable, meaning that the knight or the squire has to either keep his love a secret from her and from everybody else, or if she returns his love, then they have to keep their affair secret. But dearne can also mean, again, crafty, as well as deceptive and dishonest, which, when twinned with the notion of solace, the notion of joy and entertainment, but also sexual pleasure, hints at the ways in which Nicholas is going to be dishonest. So these duplicitous characteristics are reinforced by words like slay, meaning sly in our sense of the word, but also in the sense of wise and prudent, and privé, which means private, but also stealthy and treacherous again. And I think this is perhaps also hinted at in the next line, in which we are told that Nicholas was like a maiden meek for to see. So you can see that privé, meaning private, secret, stealthy, treacherous, is linked with to see by the tail rhyme. And I think what that's doing is, of course, suggesting that to look at, he was meek like a maiden, but perhaps there was something else, there was another agenda. So this is only ever surface level with Nicholas. He is not what he seems. Furthermore, words like Hender and like dearne clearly link Nicholas with the aristocratic world of courtly love, courtois, amour courtois. And this is also foregrounded by the word fetishly, or fetisly, which means fashionably or elegantly, specifically connected with courtly fashions. But of course it's not really appropriate for Nicholas to adopt such courtly mannerisms because they are above his social status. They are for the aristocracy, the nobility, royalty, far-off mythical knights doing grand things. And Nicholas is, as the narrator points out a few lines earlier, just a poor scolaire. He's a dirt-poor student from common stock, not from noble blood, living in the house of a carpenter in a village in Oxford, very everyday, very mundane. So such a world of courtly pretensions and amour courtois does not belong to him. It is beyond kind of the scope of what is appropriate for him to be doing and saying. Which brings us, I think, nicely onto our next topic of tone and register. Now, what do I mean when I talk about tone and register? Well, you can think about both of these as the language chosen and used for a very specific purpose or within a very specific context. So, for instance, I would use a far more formal and elevated language in writing an academic book as I would talking about the same topic or writing about the same topic in a blog, because the readership is different, the purpose of the writing is very different, and therefore my use of language needs to reflect that. Similarly, if you think about legal documents, have very particular words, have legalistic jargon and phrases that are only used again within that context. You might also think about, for example, if you write a card expressing condolences, will have a very different tone than one written to express, say, a 40th birthday celebration or something similar. So in thinking about tones, text and a text's tone and register, for example, you might be thinking about things like whether it is ironic or sentimental, whether it's serious, whether it's humorous, whether it's playful, whether it's didactic, and so on and so forth. Similarly, in thinking about register, you could think about whether a text is written in a colloquial register, whether it's conversational. So the difference between kind of colloquial and conversational is obviously I'm hoping that I am speaking to you now in a conversational tone, but I'm not speaking in a colloquial a register. I'm hoping that I'm speaking conversational register, but I'm not using the colloquial language that I would have used with my friends as a teenager growing up in North East Scotland. That's a very different register that I would have used. You might think about it being a legal register, a religious register, courtly, academic, and so on and so forth. And obviously there are many, many different tones and registers that you might be able to think about and analyse in the text, far beyond these ones. So you might be able to identify these through word choice or indeed through syntax, so the structure of sentences. And often more elevated language will have a much more complex syntax, and we'll come on to that in a minute. So in Middle English, the language in which Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are written, more elevated and formal words tend to be derived from either Latin or French, and these are often quite easy to identify because they are polysyllabic. More specifically, Latin words tend to be associated with things like religion and faith because Latin was the language of the church at the time. And French loanwords tend to belong to a more courtly context. Now, this has a historical reason. Following the Norman invasion of 1066, English as a language was denigrated, and so the language of the ruling elite became French. Now, this extract from The Knight's Tale is a good example, I think, of how register can be identified through both word choice and through syntax. So this is a description of the character of Emily from The Knight's Tale. Now, Emily is the woman over whom the two knights, who are also cousins and blood brothers, Palamon and Arcite, argue. So they fight over her. They fight over the love for her, even though she doesn't know who they are until very late in the story. So The Knight's Tale is the very first story in the Canterbury Tales, and it's the one that precedes The Miller's Tale and the one that The Miller's Tale actually responds to. And this is what we are told in this extract describing Emily and what she's up to. The season pricketh every genteel herd, and maketh it out of his sleep to stead, and saith a ris and doen min observance. This makker Emily have remembrance to doen on earth to May and for to ris. So the season, spring, pricks every gentle heart, and makes it out of his sleep to start, and say, arise and do your observance. This made Emily remember to honour May, and so to rise, to get up out of bed. So this, the season sort of prompting people to kind of go out and observe May and enjoy the spring weather, and this is what Emily is suddenly remembering and makes her get up out of bed. So, to mention here, the Knight's Tale is, as the title suggests, told by a knight, a member of the nobility and the aristocracy. And so it is elevated in terms of both tone and register, and it's signalled usefully through the use of French loanwords, words like sezum, gentil, observance, remembrance, which are suitably courtly and so appropriate both to the genre, romance, to the subject of these knights and love and battles, and to the teller of the tale. Now, compare this with an extract from The Miller's Tale. This again comes from a description of Allison, who is the carpenter's wife and the object of Hinde Nicholas's desire. Wincing she was, as is a jolly colt, long as a mast and upright as a bolt. A brooch she bar upon her low collar, as broad as is the boose of a buckler. So she was skittish like a jolly colt, long as a mast and upright as a bolt. A brooch she bore upon her low collar, so she's got a brooch on her collar, as broad as as a shield boss. So if you imagine a medieval shield, the big metal bit in the middle is a shield boss, so it's about as huge. She's wearing a massive brooch. So the first thing to note, I think, is the difference in syntax, perhaps. The description of Emily, if you note, has much longer sentences, has much more complex sentences. Chaucer uses here far more subordinate clauses, clauses that rely on other parts of the sentence to make sense. Now, while there are sentences in The Miller's Tale that run on, for example, and one example of a subordinate clause here, on the whole, the sentences are much simpler. And actually, the first 3 lines of the extract could be standalone sentences. And it's worth noting, I think, that there's not much punctuation in medieval manuscripts. So actually what you're seeing here in terms of punctuation is entirely modern editors' insertions. The next thing to note, I think, is the difference in the vocabulary. So there are far fewer multisyllable words. Usually multisyllable words, as I've mentioned, are indicative of Latin and French loanwords. And when we combine this with the syntax, I think it makes for a much more straightforward, much more conversational tone. And the register of the words are also, of course, more commonplace, more concrete, more everyday. So a colt, a mast, a bolt, a brooch, a collar. All of which, again, are appropriate to the person described, Allison, as the wife of a carpenter, is very low status. It's also appropriate to the teller of the tale, the miller, who is also of the peasant class, and to the genre of the tale, which is a fabliau, notoriously bawdy, and a genre that always only concerns characters of the peasant class or of merchants and friars and people like that. Knights very rarely feature. So I want to stick with Allison and Emily for my next example and the discussion of figurative language. So this is probably the device that is most familiar to many students, and it's an important one in terms of developing meaning in a text. So you might look out for things that you'll be familiar with already, things like simile and metaphor and symbols and imagery and things like that. But when you spot any of these, you might also want to ask whether there are any additional kind of oral or visual or other sensory effects created by the use of such figurative language. How are they working and to what effects? That's the other thing you need to think about, not just kind of what the simile is what comparisons the simile is producing, for example, but how it's doing so, how it is encouraging the reader to make certain comparisons and the effect of those comparisons. So I think, again, Chaucer's a great example of this at work and the potential of and the different ways in which the use of figurative language can be used in poetry and in writing. And again, the description of both Allison and Emily are brilliant examples of how he uses this. So let's start with Emily, because I think without looking at her, the full force of Allison's description can't really be fully appreciated. That Emily, that fairer was to sena than is the lily upon his stalk agren, and fresher than the May with flowers new, for with the rose couleur struff her hue, ye not which the finer of hem too. A clothed was she fresh for to the vis, her yellow hair was broidered in a tress behind her back a yard long as he guess, and as an angel heavenishly she sung. So, to translate, that Emily that fairer was to see than is the lily upon his stalk green, and fresher than May with flowers new. For with the rose, the colour of a rose, the hue of her face competed. I don't know which was the finer of the two. She was clothed freshly, as I think to explain. Her yellow hair was plaited in a tress behind her back, a yard long, I think. And as an angel, she heavenly, she sang. So you can see here that Emily is described through a comparison between her and traditionally courtly love flowers, so flowers that are used conventionally in courtly love poems. So the lily and the rose. And she's also compared with an entire season, spring, signalled by the month of May, all of which she either exceeds or is equal to. So in making those comparisons, we can guess what she looks like. We can imagine the lily white flower, the flawless skin that has a slightly rosy tint to it. But her facial features are never actually described. They're never actually referenced. So details like her eyes, her lips, her nose, her cheeks, her chin are not drawn attention to. They're not mentioned. Instead, we see here in the abstract. We see her in an abstract idea of beauty. She's defined by the conventional signifiers of courtly feminine beauty. And when we do have a feature expressly located for us, it's her hair, which is falling down her back. So we're seeing her from behind. We still don't actually see her face, a face which holds so much of a person's personality and identity. We're also told she has a heavenly singing voice, like an angel, reinforcing the idea that Emily is a paragon of feminine beauty, but also that she is elevated, that she is unreachable, that she's kind of almost beyond human in a sense. And I think there's that sense of kind of being unreachable and almost not really fully human is also in the comparisons between her and the flowers. So note that Chaucer doesn't invoke, for example, the sweet smell of the lily and the rose, or the vibrancy of the colour. The technique is much more oblique, much more abstract than that. There is a distance here from the objects compared. Chaucer seems to want to distance the reader from the objects and the ideas that are meant to be considered. The comparison is therefore conceptual, I think, rather than concrete and literal. And she is, of course, also a very conventional woman of courtly romance. She is a constructed ideal, an idealised version of feminine beauty, as determined by this particular culture at this particular moment in time. Her colouring is entirely conventional. Again, this is suited to the genre and to her purpose in the narrative. So what I mean by that is that her beauty must be exceptional to inspire instantly the love of the two knights, and it must also be unattainable to increase their despair and their longing. So in some sense, the reader is kind of similarly positioned and asked to engage with this woman in a very particular way. All right, compare this with Allison in The Miller's Tale. Fair was this young wife, and therewithal, as any weasel her body gent and small, and sickerly she had a licorice ee. Full small pulled were her brows too, and though were bent and black as any sloe. She was full more blissful on to say, than is the new perjonnet tray, and softer than the wool is of a weather. Her mouth was swate as bragget or the maith, o hoord of apples laid in hay or haith. She was a primerole, a pig's knee. So, fair was this young wife, and therewithal as a weasel, her body delicate and small. And certainly she had a flirtatious eye, and very narrowly plucked were her two eyebrows, and they were arched and black as any slowberry. She was more blissful to look at than the new pear jonnet tree, and softer than the wool of a sheep. Her mouth was sweet as braggot or mead, or a hoard of apples laid in hay or on the heath. She was a primrose, a pig's eye, which are both flowers. So hopefully you can see already the difference with Emily's description. Where hers invoked more abstract concepts of ideal beauty and asked the reader to admire her from afar, Allison's description invites us to get very close to her, to get very approximate to her, to touch her and to taste her. She's compared with flowers as well, but those flowers are common wildflowers that anybody can pick by the side of the road. They're not the elite cultivated roses seen in the walled gardens of courtly households. She's also repeatedly compared here and elsewhere to animals, so a weasel with sheep, and elsewhere colt and a calf, which is again very common animals, and also in some cases young animals that kind of speak to her own youth. But also I think connecting her with animals suggests that she kind of lacks an element of reason and rationality, and that she's very much driven by bodily needs and bodily desires. Notice also that these descriptions of her also often focus our attention expressly on her body. So this starts very early on when the narrator describes the apron which covers her loins, and he expressly uses the word loins. So this description is obviously covering her loins, but it's also making the reader expressly think about them. So in covering them up, you are expressly focusing on them in a way. We also hear here about her eyebrows and her flirtatious, but licorice can also mean lecherous eye, and her small waisted body. Note too that the descriptive similes often relate to food and drink, so specifically fruit, and soft-fleshed fruit, which I think is important, slowberries, pears, apples, with obvious connotations of original sin there when Eve took the apple from the tree of knowledge. And also to low-status country drinks like mead, which is made from honey, and braggot, both very sweet things. And all of this, I think, suggests that she is accessible, so the commonness of these items of food and drink suggests that she is attainable. She's also obviously consumable and sweet in the tasting. So all of these things are sweet to taste and enjoyable to taste, and that, of course, inflects on Allison as well. And I think this particular line in the middle of the extract exemplifies the effects of such figurative language, but also how those effects are created. So this is what he says: "She was full more blissful on to say than is the new pear jonnet tree." Now, pear jonnet is a type of early ripe pear. So early signifies again how young she is. Ripe also signifies kind of a sexual maturity, I suppose. And the stress of the verse emphasizes, I think, the fruit over the tree on which it grows. So actually the sentence is about saying that she's more blissful to see than the pear tree, than kind of a new pear tree in blossom. But the stress, the landing of the stress with the word pear jonnet, I think makes us focus on the pear rather than the tree on which it's grown. So I think we are invited here to imagine a ripe, juicy pear, the shape of which, of course, is similar or can be compared to a woman's body, or the conventional shape of a woman's body. And when a reader thinks about a pear, perhaps they think about what it might be like to touch it, what the skin might feel like, what it might be to bite into it, perhaps at the roundest point of its shape, what it might actually be to taste it, what it might feel like to have the juice dripping down your chin, the actual sensation of the pressure of biting and then it giving way. And in doing so, I think the comparison draws on the reader's own sensory experiences in order to imagine this woman, not just what she looks like, but how she can be interacted with and what her characteristics are, what we can expect from her. And also, of course, again, how available she is and how proximate she is. She's there to be had. So there are other sensory similes that used that likewise invoke the reader's sensory imagination to build a picture of this woman. So her mouth, we are told, is sweet, an expressly sensory adjective like apples, and we're told that she is softer than sheep's wool. So again, a different sense invoked of tactile comparison that again brings us very, very intimately proximate to this young woman. And her description, of course, and her accessibility and how we perceive her is fitting for the genre of the tale, is fitting for the events of the tale, and so for her role in the narrative. Okay, so I just want to finish off by talking a little bit about form and style. So like all aspects of literary writing, form is a conscious choice, and it can often relate to, for example, a text's meanings, to the social and literary conventions. It might be appropriate to a particular occasion or whatever the text is being written for. And it also, of course, can shape the expectations of a reader, whether that is then fulfilled in the text or subverted. So if it's a poetic extract, you might think about, for example, what kind of a poem it is. Is it a ballad? Is it a lyric? Is it a sonnet? Is it an epic? What kind of metre is it using? Is it, for example, ottave rime, blank verse, rhyme royal, iambic pentameter? Is it trochaic, dactylic? Is it stress verse, or is it in fact free verse? You can also think about things like its structure. So is it in stanzas? Is it in cantos? Is it in fits? How is it kind of structured overall, and how does that affect a reader's engagement with a text, but also how its content is conveyed? And I think you can ask similar questions of prose works as well. You might also want to think about other poetic devices, how they might be used to affect this or create specific effects in relation to rhyme and structure. So, for example, you might think about how rhyme or alliteration or internal rhyme fits into the structure of the whole. You might think about how anaphora is used, thinking about styles. So anaphora of the repetition of words and phrases at the beginning of successive clauses. You might think about, obviously, onomatopoeia, about concatenation, so the linking of verses or stanzas through, for example, repeated rhyme sounds, or through words or phrases or things like alliteration. So in whatever text you're looking at and whatever kind of form and style you're looking at in the text, always consider the relationship between form and style and meaning, because form can be as important as the other devices. It's not just an empty case into which words are put. It is fundamental to the reception and the meaning of the work. So you can ask, for example, if particular concepts are related to or emphasised by features of style and form. So, for example, as we've looked at in some of the examples from Chaucer, do key words land on metrical stress? So that example of perjonit tre, for example. Are certain concepts placed in tension or opposition or compared through antithesis or through rhyme? Even are two ideas linked through rhyme, and how does that linking affect how we interpret each of those ideas? So here we have an example, if you remember early on when we were talking about the linking through rhyme of privé and to say, and how that affected our interpretation of the character of Nicholas. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that short lecture on close reading and our little forays into Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And I hope it also gave you some ideas about how to conduct an effective close reading for text, as well as the possibilities for really detailed analysis that the skill of close reading really makes possible. If you have any questions or you have any comments, I'd be very happy to receive them and to answer them. You can reach me at c.wright-468@kent.ac.uk. Thanks so much for listening, and all the very best with your studies.